I want to welcome back to the stream Dr. Zach Foster, historian of Palestine, main contributor and founder of Palestine Nexus, a newsletter and a series of, as you're just saying, teachings and on different specific subjects within the history of Palestine. And so thank you for coming back.
Anytime, Marcus. Happy to be back.
The last time we had spoken, the main events were happening, more strictly within Gaza, and an expansion of some of the ethnic cleansing into the West Bank territories with the Houthis, Hezbollah, some groups out of Iraq playing on the margins. Since then, with some of your hot takes, you knocked out Joe Biden as a presidential candidate. And also there's been a major expansion towards the north as regards to Hezbollah. First, how do you see Hezbollah and as it integrates into Lebanon and where they sit in kind of the historical context of whether Palestinian liberation movement or buttressing against Israel?
Hezbollah was a movement founded in reaction to, as a response to Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon that began in 1982. Recall that Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 and besieged Beirut for nearly 2 months, killing something like 5,000 Lebanese and Palestinians. They sponsored the Sabra and Shatila massacre, during which 3,500 Palestinians were slaughtered by forces allied with the Israeli military. And in response to that, and then after the end of the war, Israeli forces stayed in Lebanon. They occupied southern Lebanon south of the Litani River for nearly 2 decades, from 82 to 2000. And it was as a response to that military occupation that, guess what happened? A resistance movement emerged, right? So this is the case in all times, in all places, in all human history. If you have an aggressive, a brutal, a military occupation, a foreign military occupation where people are arrested and detained and imprisoned and tortured regularly for decades, well, guess what? You're going to get resistance. And that's exactly what happened in the case of South Lebanon. And so you've got this movement known as Hezbollah that emerged in reaction to, in response to that military occupation. And ultimately, Israel realized in 2000 that this occupation was a failure, that Israeli soldiers were facing constant attacks. And so the Israeli military decided to withdraw back to Israel's borders prior to that invasion. And so Hezbollah declared victory, rightly so. And liberated their prisoners, right? You had literally Israeli soldiers left prisoners behind bars. They abandoned the prisons. Hezbollah soldiers liberated the prisoners. It was a very euphoric moment in the history of Lebanon. And over the past 24 years, Hezbollah has gained power and gained strength and gained influence in Lebanon. For lots of reasons, in part because, first of all, recall that, the United States effectively made the Lebanese army quite weak. They basically prevented the Lebanese army from really developing any kind of serious fighting force. And that was in order to prevent them from basically kind of acting as any kind of, resistance to Israel. Israel being the kind of American satellite state in the Middle East. And so here you had Hezbollah receiving arms, receiving training, receiving weapons, receiving funds from Iran. And they grew in strength and grew in power. And Nasrallah became even more popular over the past 2 decades. And you hear people speak about Nasrallah today. Really, he was not just a political leader, not just a military commander, but he was really a guiding light. I mean, he was, you hear his speeches, he was educated, he was thoughtful. He talked about colonialism and he talked about imperialism. He talked about a future in which Lebanon would also be a pluralistic state. It has Christians, it has Shia, it has Sunni. So he embraced that kind of pluralism. At the same time, I think he got a lot of criticism for his role in supporting the Assad regime in Syria. And I think plenty of that criticism was quite rightly justified. So Hezbollah is a complicated organization. But I think on the eve of October 7th, what happened was that Israel, on October 8th, Hezbollah attacked the Sheba farms. These are the farms that when Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000, the one area of Lebanon they did not withdraw from was the Sheba farms. And that was the area that Hezbollah attacked on October 8th. Right. So actually, they did not attack Israel on October 8th. They attacked occupied Lebanon, or if you ask Israel, they attacked occupied Syria. But basically, they did not attack Israel, even according to Israel's own understanding of who controls that territory.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, if you ask yourself in the past year, who has done the most to try to bring an end to one of the worst crimes in all of human history, certainly one of the worst crimes of the 21st century, that is Israel's genocidal onslaught in Gaza. If you ask yourself, who has done the most to try and bring an end to that genocide? Well, it's the Houthis in Yemen, it's the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, and it's Hezbollah. You could say, to quote Max Blumenthal, this is the moral equivalent of bombing the railroad tracks that were going into Auschwitz. And I think that analogy is quite apt, because here you have a government and a military totally unrestrained, dropping 2,000-pound bombs on civilians in Gaza on a daily basis for nearly a year. And the United States does nothing. The Arab world does nothing. Europe does nothing. The entire world stands by, as international law, as international humanitarian law has proven to be a total failure. It has failed the Palestinians. But armed resistance from Hezbollah seems to be the only opportunity, the only possibility that the Palestinians in Gaza have. That is the light at the end of the tunnel for the Palestinians. And that is why, by the way, when Iran sent missiles into Israel, Gaza experienced a state of euphoria. The Palestinian people in Gaza were cheering. They saw the missiles land in the southern desert, in the Negev, in the Nakab, and they were cheering. They were euphoric because Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthis, leaving aside all the other reasons you may dislike them for, and there are plenty of reasons to dislike them, but what they've done in the case of Gaza is the moral equivalence of bombing the train tracks that were leading into Auschwitz.
And you mentioned the United States doing nothing. It would be much better if the United States did nothing. I think the more, there's a lot of alarming sense of the lack of substance, relevancy of international law. Some of these UN bodies, whether it's the UN Security Council, or even just the General Assembly. However, especially as it regards Hezbollah, their ability, there's this Resolution 1701 that gets brought up, consistently. I think it's from 2006. And in there, well, for one thing, it is almost laughable to have governments like the United States and Israel utilizing any type of international law at this point. Reading through it, and it's like, not too interesting, but no real declarative statements to actually say, hey, by this date, just like the same type of UN mealy mouth speak of encouraging this government to do that, hoping for this, and all the things of that nature. And yet just the United States keeps trying to pressure these things while completely disregarding any even normalcy and any type of sense when it comes to what we consider normal conflict, any, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean in this world. But one of the things I think that was most alarming for people with any type of moral standard was this telecommunications terror attack that ended up maiming thousands of people, killing children, just indiscriminately explosions. Can you describe, is this any type of new tactic by Israel, and where do some of these types of indiscriminate attacks sit with this Zionist state?
Well, we shouldn't be at all surprised that Israel has no interest in preserving civilian life. I mean, anyone who's paying any attention to what Israel has been doing in Gaza for the past year, or for that matter, the West Bank for the past year, or for that matter, Gaza or the West Bank for the past many, many decades, Israel's attitude has long been use overwhelming, disproportionate force, punish the civilians in order to bring about a change in the political situation, right? That has been the stated goal. This is not something Israeli leaders are hiding. This is the explicit goal. This is, if we punish the civilian population enough, they will turn against their leaders. This is known as the Dahiyya doctrine that Israel developed in Lebanon, right? This was Israel's attitude, that they pursued in Lebanon going all the way back to the 1980s. It was punish the civilians so that they will turn against their own political leaders. And so if you look at what Israel did in this pager terrorist attack, right, it was obviously indiscriminate in the sense that Israel doesn't know who was holding these pagers. In fact, we later learned that many of those pagers were used by doctors and nurses, and they blew up in hospitals. In one case, it was a doctor that was treating two small children, and it blew up. And I can't recall if it wounded or killed, but there were casualties in a hospital, right? So indiscriminate attacks. Beyond that, I mean, if you really think of what kind of getting at the real meaning of what a terrorist attack is, the goal is to inflict terror, to inspire a terror. And that is precisely what this attack was intended to do. And that is why, by the way, the former CIA director, Leon Panetta, said himself, he said this was a terrorist attack. You don't even need to ask Arabs or Lebanese or Palestinians. You can just ask the United States government's own military and security officials. Of course, this is a terrorist attack. If you're targeting, people who are riding on buses, who are shopping in supermarkets, who are in hospitals, who may have been on planes for all we know, right? Who may have been on buses. We have no idea where these people could have been at the time of the attack. So this is the definition of a terrorist attack, and it was indiscriminate, and it killed countless civilians. And I think, even to obsess over this one attack, right, as if Israel is somehow precise in who its targets, immediately became a moot point just days later when Israel dropped a dozen 2,000-pound bombs in densely crowded neighborhoods of southern Beirut, slaughtering 550 Lebanese in a single day. There were roughly about 650 Israeli civilians killed on October 7th. Israel killed nearly that many civilians on a single day in Lebanon just 2 weeks ago, just a week and a half ago. And where was the outrage, right? Where was the international condemnations? Instead, what you had the United States government, U.S. officials, State Department spokesperson get up and say, we back Israel. We support Israel. We're going to send another. In the past year, the United States has sent $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel so that it can slaughter civilians in Lebanon and slaughter civilians in Gaza and slaughter civilians in the West Bank. And so just a double standard. Even calling it a double standard, it's just true hypocrisy. And here we are, having to live with the consequences, and we will be. And you know who will suffer? You know who will pay the price? It will be American civilians, and it will be the American people who. We don't have money for disaster relief. We don't have money for hurricane victims, but we do have money to kill Gazan and Lebanese children.
It's almost laughable hearing it's like this hurricane relief argument. They're talking about money in like the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. And there was just 9 billion that, in more weapons shipments that just get sent over. And it is it's a horrifying joke. But I do want to ask you of like some of the concern of spreading escalation, because as you mentioned, like between Yemen and Hezbollah, some of the other resistance groups out of Iraq, the only ones actually physically getting in the way from a genocidal regime. One thing that kind of like, I don't know, scared the shit out of me to like lack of a better term, but the Israel strike on the Russian air base in Syria. How do you see this? I think a lot of people, have been saying that Israel is just trying to goad the United States into a larger war with Iran. But what does it signify of dragging Russia potentially into this type of conflict?
Well, I think historically, Israel has tried its best to play nice with Russia. First of all, there are 1 million plus 1.5 million Russians living in Israel. These are Jews who migrated to Israel. I mean, many of them are non-Jews, by the way, who migrated to Israel after the fall of the Soviet Union. And, they still have Russian passports. They go to Russia. Many of them still have family and friends in Russia, and they still have connections to that country. And their native language is Russian. They very much identify as Russian. And so Israel has tried historically to let's say temper its kind of hostilities towards Russia. Even in the aftermath of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the Israeli government was very careful not to come out on one side or the other. You'll recall there were not statements, "Oh, we support the people of Ukraine." No, that was not the Israeli response. In fact, you had Israeli leaders travel and try and kind of act almost as sort of playing the middleman, trying to broker agreements and trying to bring about a ceasefire, right? So that has historically been the position of the Israeli government towards Russia. Now, and so now it's in a very careful dance. With this attack, as you pointed out, I believe it was, right immediately adjacent or directly in front of that Russian military base. But it's the largest Russian presence, largest Russian military presence anywhere in the Middle East, right? So this was a serious affront to Russia. And you heard the statements coming out of the Russian government afterwards, like back the off. So this is, who knows what could happen if Israel angers Russia? God only knows what could happen there. But as it is, we already see this sort of kind of alliance developing, and it has been developing for many, many years between Russia and Iran. There's nothing new about this, right? If you're kind of on the blacklist of the United States government, you're naturally going to gravitate towards one another and form alliances with the other people on that blacklist. And so that has been the case between Russia and Iran for many, many years now. And so I think Israel is sort of making a huge strategic blunder here by pushing Russia even further against it. But just to the broader question of where things are headed in terms of the Israel-Iran confrontation, I am very, very pessimistic. I'm quite worried about this, and I think everyone is discounting the likelihood of a dramatic escalation here, because you have to remember, the people in power in Israel are not rational actors. These people are messianists. They're fascists. They, for the most part, want to ethnically cleanse Palestine, want to purge Israel and Palestine of all Palestinians. These people are not acting yet with any sense of restraint or rationality. They've been goading on Iran for more than a year now. Right. And so they've already said very clearly, we will attack Iran in a counterstrike. We will, a counterstrike to the counterstrike. So it's a counterstrike. And Iran has already said, we will counter your counterstrike with a counterstrike, one that is an increase in severity. So we are on the escalation train. And where does it end? It's seemingly the only actor that can pull Israel back is the United States. And what has the U.S. done? What has the U.S. said to Israel in the past week? They said, "Oh, guys, if you promise you won't attack Iranian oil fields, we'll give you even more weapons. Yeah. We'll give you an even greater carte blanche, a blank check to do whatever you want." So here you have the United States being the only thing that can hold back Israel. And even then, it's a carrot. It's not a stick. We'll give you more guns, more bombs, more planes. Just don't blow up Iranian oil fields.
It's a damn carrot farm. And that seems like the most obvious thing, especially as like Netanyahu seemingly would want Trump just so, there would be no question. There would be not even the semblance of any statements of Palestinian civilians that are somehow lost. But there's really no issue with Biden. There's really no issue with Blinken, and I don't see the report of going into detail as to what the verbiage is to allow Israel to basically indiscriminately kill aid workers and say, well, they were just Hamas, but also allow the United States to have some semblance of, we got an agreement to allow aid workers in. But essentially the United States and Blinken was signing off a deal to lead lambs to the slaughter, when it comes to these, UN and other organizations, to include the World Central Kitchen, who Biden and Obama is friends with the guy who runs it. And that was just a moment in time where they actually had to address the barbarity of the, IDF. And then it just moves along. Speaking of the tensions with Russia, there was another kind of international dust up within recently, and like dust up. But with Emmanuel Macron, and obviously like there's a lot of French residents in Lebanon, for reasons, and just as simple of like, really calling out some of the Western states, which is it's been so long, it's a kind of absurd that he's even saying it now. But at least there is that obvious truth. How do you call for a ceasefire and then hand over tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons? Netanyahu comes out with this ridiculous video of like shame on them and shame on all these other governments. Also his speech at the UN, which is it just reminds you, at least for me, it just reminds me of another guy with an accent. But at the end of the day, is there any real pushback you see from France or any of those like the Western governments by this brazen display of, at the very least, disrespect for other governments and nation states and the populace in Lebanon?
You do start to see some changes in Europe. Again, I would say they're at the margins, but yeah, you saw the Macron announcement that we're going to stop sending arms to Israel that are used in Gaza. But of course, France doesn't really supply any arms to Israel. They're not even one of the top three. It's basically the United States supplies 90% of the arms, and then UK and Germany kind of combined to supply the remaining 10%. I don't even know if France was supplying anything to begin with. So it wouldn't even surprise me if this was essentially all talk and no action. The same was true of the UK, where they a couple of weeks ago made a similar declaration to the effect of we're going to limit the issuance of new contracts. But again, the vast majority of the contracts have already been signed, and there was no change made to those. So again, these are statements made on the margins, because I think some of these European leaders have sort of come to the realization that they themselves, unless they start to take meaningful action, could be implicated in a complicity in the genocide. Because as the genocide continues, it becomes more and more obvious that the evidence continues to mount. The ICJ case that will be tried over the course of the next many, many years, that case, the evidence for South Africa and the other countries that are joining that case, the evidence continues to mount. Because as long as Israel is still in Gaza, as long as they're still dropping bombs, as long as they're still cutting off humanitarian aid, all of those things are continuing. The case for genocide becomes stronger and stronger, which means the case for the complicity of the European states in that genocide also becomes stronger, which means these European leaders are feeling the heat. They don't want cases being brought against them by the ICC or the ICJ. So I think you're starting to see that. You're starting to see cracks below the surface. But again, these are, I think, sort of to save face, but they're not real meaningful because they're not actually doing anything to change the situation on the ground.
Going to the ICC case, do you think that actually has any type of substantive help other than outside of like other nation states being able to point at the West and saying, hey, you're just hypocrites too. You don't have a right to tell us what is right or morally correct anymore. Does this just kind of break the semblance of that international rules-based order, that kind of the 90s vibe, and then it's just kind of have to wait for the world to rebuild itself in some other order?
I think you're exactly correct. I think that we are starting to see some changes. I was just looking for a post because we saw just the other day, just this week, we're starting to see more and more countries take these ICC and ICJ cases seriously. You saw just a few months ago, the Maldives began to reject Israeli passports, not recognize them in the Maldives. You saw just earlier this week, I'm trying to find this tweet, but you have more and more countries basically cutting off arms. We've seen already many weapons manufacturing companies across the globe, from the Netherlands and Spain, also to Japan, cut off ties with Israel. You saw Intel, by the way, cancel a multi-billion-dollar plan. I forget if it was a factory or some kind of operation center in Israel. They canceled those plans. Israel is, 60,000 businesses have gone under in Israel in the past year. Okay. The tourism industry is dead. Moody just cut Israel's ratings by 2 notches. In addition to the notch it had already cut.
Yeah. Yep.
So now we're 3 notches, and things are just going to get worse and worse, right? Israel is digging itself a deeper and deeper grave here. South Lebanon is not going to go well. I can guarantee you that. Israel may have decapitated the leadership, but I can promise you that the fighters who saw their leader, their spiritual leader, slaughtered in an attack, killing hundreds of innocent Lebanese citizens, you think they're going to lose their motivation to fight? No. If anything, they're even more motivated now than they ever have been. They've been preparing for this invasion for decades. Since 2006, they've been preparing for this, war against Israel. So, and then the situation in Gaza, by the way, is not going well either. You had just this past week multiple resistance operations. You saw Hamas, and actually it was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters, Rise of Hezbollah. They attacked a Merkava tank, launched a decisive blow, blowing up a armored personnel carrier, continuing the resistance operations seemingly unimpeded by Israel's ongoing onslaught. So the situation for the Israeli public, for the Israeli economy, for Israeli passports, for the Israeli military is not looking good. And just to cite a couple of figures here, we saw already in December 2023. So we're nearing on a year since these reports surfaced, but Israeli trauma centers reported that 10,000 Israelis had been wounded in armed conflict, in fighting, in just those 2 months, in just basically, a late October to late December.
Yeah,
that was 10 months ago.
Oh yeah. I didn't hear that.
The fighting has escalated on every single front. Okay, so is it 20,000 wounded now, 30,000 wounded? You're talking about massive casualties on the Israeli side. Not to mention, they reported something like 25% of armored personnel carriers had been destroyed and put out of service just in Gaza alone, against essentially a ragtag fighting force of, a few tens of thousands of Hamas fighters operating underground, having a homemade kind of a weapons industry, not being able to import weapons. So, you're talking about an army that is battered, a public that is suffering economically. And then I think a government that is increasingly isolated, whose leaders are facing ICC warrants. Israel is on a path towards self-destruction right now.
Now, trying to assess, I think that there's a lot of people who kind of think that Netanyahu is pushing around the United States government, which I tend to disagree with. The United States is happy to just buttress its own economy by having this grand delivery mechanisms of tens of billions of dollars over to like Raytheon and General, Dynamics and all of those things. Joe Biden said himself, if Israel didn't exist, we'd create it, and that type of footprint, just looking at the tactical advantage of having that territory, and then also having, like you said, like a rogue state that is willing to showcase all of these F-35s, weapon systems on innocent civilians, while also broadening that effective geographical space that I'm sure that Blinken and the rest are just hoping that, even as you can see that they're pressuring the Lebanese government to choose a more favorable leadership to the West. And it's just like this blind lust for more and more domination. How do you see some of the United States, I guess, quote unquote, diplomatic efforts, as they are saying that they're attempting to work tirelessly, versus what's actually happening on the background? What do you think the take is going on back in actually the Situation Room?
It's a hypocrisy to a level I've never seen before in my entire life. I mean, we've always talked about U.S. hypocrisy. We claim we promote democracy and human rights, but then we fund and support autocratic regimes, apartheid regimes, who have no concern whatsoever for civilian life. And in fact, what you've seen in just the past couple of weeks in the case of Lebanon is that policy of just. It's kind of Gaza 2.0. Do you know the backdrop to why Israel assassinated Nasrallah? The backstory is that Nasrallah had agreed to a 3-week ceasefire. Yeah. Right. So Nasrallah basically said, "Look, we're not willing to agree to a permanent ceasefire because so long as the genocide in Gaza continues, we will continue to bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz." Okay, so we're not going to agree to a permanent ceasefire. We will agree to a 3-week ceasefire. And Israel said, okay, well, you know what? You don't want to agree to a ceasefire? Okay, well, a permanent, you don't want to, you're unwilling. Basically, the 3-week ceasefire isn't good enough. And so that's why they assassinated Nasrallah. But Nasrallah actually was willing to make compromises, but those compromises were insufficient for Israel. And the U.S. effectively greenlit the operation. I would say they greenlit the ground operation. I think Israel told the United States just moments before they carried out the strike on Nasrallah himself. And apparently Lloyd George was infuriated by not being told further, given more advanced time. Warning. But look, the United States is, after October 7th, there were, the United States government chartered special flights outside of Israel to evacuate American citizens living in Israel. Of course, in Israel, not in Gaza. But then in Lebanon, right, where there's massive aerial bombardment,
they gotta pay.
Where there's 60,000 Americans in Lebanon. What has the United States government done for them? The answer, effectively, nothing. They've done absolutely nothing. There are no flights out of Lebanon anymore. The ones if you're lucky enough to get a seat on an airplane, that ticket will cost you thousands and thousands of dollars, to fly to Athens or to fly to Paris. But the United States has effectively done nothing. No charter flights. They're offering loans that need to be paid back, but effectively nothing. And here we are, our own citizens living under the bombs, being slaughtered like all other Lebanese. This is an indiscriminate attack. Israel is dropping bombs in Sidon. They're dropping bombs in the south. They're dropping bombs in the north, in Tripoli. They're dropping bombs in Beirut proper itself, in South Beirut. It doesn't matter. There's no sense of distinguishing between civilians and combatants. That violates Israel's principal military objective, which is inflict terror in the people. So they turn against the government. They turn against Hezbollah. So there's no attempt to discriminate between civilians and combatants. And so American citizens are living in terror right now as a result of the United States government support for Israel. So the United States government is just letting its own citizens die because they're of the wrong nationality. And ultimately, that is what the United States government has been doing to the Palestinian Americans as well for decades, right? So there's nothing new about this policy. It's an ongoing continuation of longstanding U.S. policy, which values some lives and devalues others.
Yeah, I mean, that's where, the lives that they can utilize to continue with just the maintenance of empire, they're just used flippantly. And what you said, like things in some of these actions, some of this just like blind support is in a manner that you have not seen in the context of, and what I'll say too, is this like this strange thing of like this 1-year anniversary of 100+ year ethnic cleansing and genocidal project, but going back to the institution, like the first ideological signatures of Zionism, of its ethno state, going to 1948 and the Nakba. And is this moment on its own so horrific that it is outside of anything else, or are there other points in history that this references that you follow?
The people of Gaza had experienced at least 2 October 7ths in the previous decade and a half leading up to October 7th. In 2008, 2009, the Israeli government slaughtered 1,500 people in the Gaza Strip over the course of a few weeks in December 2008 and January 2009, known as Operation Cast Lead. Okay, and if you do the math and do kind of deaths, and by the way, most of those 1,500 were civilians. Over 1,000, about 990 were civilians. So again, same general proportion here. The vast majority of the people killed are uninvolved, they're innocent, and yet they're slaughtered. And so they experienced their first. And again, if you do the math and try and do per capita deaths, this was kind of October 7th times 5.
Yep.
Okay. Because there's 2 million people in Gaza and there's 10 million people in Israel. Right. And so if you say 700 Israeli civilians were killed on October 7th and 900 were killed in Gaza, it's actually more like times 6 or times. So in 2008, 2009, the people of Gaza experienced 6 October 7ths. Okay. Maybe 7 or 8. In 2014, Israel slaughtered 2,200 Palestinians in Gaza, 1,500 of whom were civilians, 550 of whom were children. Okay, so do the math. What's that? 10, 11, 12 October 7th. So, the people of Gaza on a per capita basis had experienced something like, 15 to 20 October 7th in just the previous decade and a half. Again, just looking at the number of people killed, the number of innocent civilians slaughtered, that is more or less the figure you would arrive at if you crunch the numbers. And then if we look at what has happened since, I can't even do the mental math because we're talking about many, many hundreds, if not many, many thousands of October 7th have been perpetrated against the people of Gaza since October 7th. Again, if we're just strictly speaking, looking at the number of innocent people killed, leaving aside the broader context of who is the colonizer and who is the colonized, who is the occupier, who is the occupied, leaving all that aside, just looking at, because if you factor all that in, if you factor in the context of, then there isn't even any moral equivalence at all. October 7th, albeit many innocent civilians were killed. If you factor in the context, you're talking about a resistance operation that was very clearly going after military targets, and many civilians were killed along the way. Whereas in the Israeli operations, it's precisely the opposite. It's not, you're not resisting occupation and apartheid. No, you're carrying out operations in order to continue your occupation and continue your apartheid. And so as soon as you factor in the context, the historical context, the comparisons don't even make sense anymore. You're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing, killing, let's say, civilians for a just cause, which is, of course, unethical, versus killing civilians in the name of an unethical, unjust cause, right? So, that's kind of how I would describe sort of, trying to put things in context, especially the context of October 7th.
And I don't say not just October 7th, but like going back to, and that's where it's like when people say, oh, that October 7th is the worst thing to happen to Jews since the Holocaust. They strip all kinds, just say, hey, there's a lot of people died then, and this is the most Jews have died ever since. When it comes to a lot of people situate the Nakba as the huge dispel and indiscriminate killing, ethnic cleansing, do you see this as one of those great crimes of the 21st century? How do you even make sense of this moment in the trajectory of time, I guess?
Well, I think if you think about the trajectory of the Palestine question from its origins in the late 19th century to the present, there are really two key moments. You could say a third one as well, but two primary moments in that history that have really defined the trajectory of that Palestine question. The first was obviously 1948, and the second was 2023, and maybe you could throw in 1967 as a third. But there's really sort of before 48 and after 48. Why? Because during the period from roughly November 47 until roughly March 49, but even calling it ending in March 49 is a bit of a misnomer because actually the expulsions continued until 1953. So it was sort of and they continued after 53 as well. And then you had more expulsions in 67. And then even from 67 to 93, you had another 300,000 Palestinians expelled. But we'll get to that in a second. But basically, 48 was obviously, the critical moment in the history of the Palestine question, because it was during that war fought between the Palestinian people and the Zionist community, during which the Zionist forces led by the Haganah and led by Irgun and the Lehi gangs, that they went village to village and expelled something like 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, and then prevented by force of arms any of those refugees from returning to their homes at the end of the war. And so that created this Palestinian refugee issue. And so you have 200,000 Palestinians in Gaza after the end of that war. You have another many hundreds of thousands in the West Bank, 400,000 or so in the West Bank, another 100,000 in Lebanon, another 100,000 in Syria. So you're talking about, and it was really those refugees. If you ask yourself, who joined the resistance movements, who became the fighters, who who was willing to pick up arms and kind of put their lives on the line for the cause of Palestine, was the refugees. Yeah, because they were displaced, they were stateless, they were impoverished, Their livelihoods were stolen from them. Well, if your livelihood has been stolen from you and you're a stateless person living under, the boot of some other foreign regime now, whether in the Gaza Strip under Egypt or, under the Jordanian monarchy in the West Bank or in Lebanon, your life has been ruined. Well, of course you're going to pick up arms to fight. So that was the first kind of critical moment that really defined the first kind of phase of the Israel-Palestine question, which was all these refugees forming groups, Fatah, PFLP, DFLP, PLO, and carrying out attacks against Israel for the simple reason that they were expelled from their homes and impoverished and made stateless, and their hope and their dignity was stripped away from them. So of course they're going to pick up arms and resist. So that defined really the first phase of the Israel-Palestine question. And then the second phase, you could say, beginning in 1967, when Israel conquered those territories in Gaza and the West Bank, and then subjected those Palestinians who were themselves made refugees 18 years earlier to a brutal military occupation for 2 decades, that eventually blew up in Israel's face in the first Intifada. And then you saw the rise of the new resistance movements, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas. And that really defined the second major phase of this of the trajectory of the question, where the earlier groups, the Fatahs and the PFLPs, they faded into the background. And then it was the Hamases and the Palestinian Islamic Jihads. They rose up. And they were the ones that carried out the attacks against Israeli targets in the 1990s and the 2000s. And that really brings us up almost to the present day. And then you saw even those groups kind of entrench themselves, Hamas, really kind of, I think, surprised everyone on October 7th. But then you saw the rise of new, younger groups like the Jenin Brigade, like the Lions Den in Nablus, and these other armed militant groups in Gaza and the West Bank who have kind of risen up in the 2020s. So we have kind of almost a third phase, a third wave. And now I think beginning since 2023, this is sort of the next major kind of shift in the Palestine question, which is to say that for the foreseeable future, you're going to see armed resistance against Israel. This isn't going to end. It's just going to get worse. You may defeat one group, another group will pop up. And that's exactly what we're seeing. In the West Bank today, there are not 1 or 2, but there's 10 fronts. There are 10 fronts in the West Bank. There are 10 armed groups in Gaza right now. You have the Houthis who have joined the struggle. You have Shia militias in Iraq and Syria who have joined the struggle. They weren't, fighting against Israel in 2022 and 2020 on the eve of October 7th. They had this was not their focus. They were actually focused on, say, American military targets, or maybe they were focused on attacking, other soft targets in the region, but they were not attacking Israel. Now Israel has brought itself new enemies. It has attracted the ire of more and more rebels and more armed groups. This is just going to get worse and worse for Israel. They're entering a new phase of permanent armed conflict with not 1, not 2, but at least on 7 different fronts with at least a dozen, if not more, armed groups. That is the future. In addition to Iran, so that is kind of, I think the new trajectory is basically armed conflict and armed struggle for the indefinite future.
That does not bode well. Something that I did want to ask too is with the negotiations. I think it's like some of those like iconic Western narratives is Bill Clinton bringing people to Oslo or bringing the Oslo Accords, bringing to Camp David and having these types of discussions and all this type of stuff. And I remember as a kid, I remember seeing news stories, some of these like types of things, like as far as these types of negotiations, if you could actually give just a description, how do you see the Oslo Accords, Camp David talks and all those types of things, and, how would you describe those? And then also, are there similarities as to what's going on now? These seem semblance of being just a veil of diplomacy.
I think it's easy to look back at the Oslo process and describe it as a total failure from the very get-go. I don't take that view. There were many Palestinians, by the way. I wouldn't say many. There were some Palestinians who did take that view. For example, Edward Said, from the very moment the Oslo process was signed, was very critical of Yasser Arafat and basically saying he just abandoned 78% of Palestine, which was basically Israel proper. He abandoned the refugees who are not included at all. He didn't include anyone in the Palestinian territories themselves in this process. But I think it is easy to forget that there was certainly a moment in time there, in 1993 when those accords were signed, that there was a real moment of optimism. That look, maybe Israel is coming around. Maybe Israel is really willing to withdraw from the occupied territories and allow Palestinians a real state, real sovereignty. But I think that hope faded relatively quickly, right? It was a brief moment. It was a moment, but quite brief, because very quickly I think most people realized that Israel was using the Oslo process as a vehicle for its new policy that it began to develop in the early 90s, even before Oslo, really beginning in 1991, this process of hafrada, separation, right? This was the kind of the Israeli mentality. And the Oslo process was a vehicle for separation. So what do I mean by that? Beginning in 91, and obviously continuing well into the mid-90s, and obviously all the way to the present day, Israel began to require Palestinians in the occupied territories to obtain permits to work in Israel, whereas previously they were given those permits automatically. And so in 91, 40% of Gazans were working either in Israeli settlements in Gaza or in Israel proper. And then that figure was 30% in the West Bank. So you had a huge percentage of the Palestinian people whose livelihoods were threatened literally overnight, beginning in 1991. And then during the Oslo process, Israel doubled down on that policy. It made it harder to get those work permits, especially after 96, 97. It began to impose lockdowns and closures on Palestinians in the territories, right? So in Gaza and the West Bank, Israeli military would set up checkpoints preventing those Palestinians from leaving their refugee camps, from leaving their towns and cities. And this was catastrophic, right? You had 70% unemployment in Gaza in 96. And the World Food Program, in response, spun up an emergency food operation to supply food to 10,000 Palestinian families in the Gaza Strip going hungry in 1996, right? So Israel's policy was, we're going to separate, separate but equal. Ever heard that expression before? But so we're going to, we need, and then that policy continued into the 2000s. We're going to build a wall, right? We're going to close Palestinians in. We're gonna destroy the Gaza airport and the Gaza seaport. We're gonna cut off the Palestinians from the outside world, and enclose them, besiege them, prevent them from leaving, prevent them from moving around, prevent them from entering Israel. Just lock them into smaller and smaller cages, and that is exactly what you've seen in the past year, right? The Gaza has shrunk. Israel has basically divided Gaza. It has divided the north from the south by the Netzarim corridor. They've cut off about 10% of the West Bank. They've expanded that buffer, right? The same is happening in the West Bank. You've had, large areas of Area C have been ethnically cleansed. They're cleansing Palestinians in Khomsa in the north of the West Bank. They're cleansing Palestinians in the south, Hebron Hills. They're cleansing Palestinians from Jerusalem. They're cleansing Palestinians from the E1 zone, from Khan al-Ahmar. They're cleansing Palestinians from the north, from Beitah. They're cleansing Palestinians from large areas of the West Bank, pushing them into smaller and smaller cantons. You can call them Bantustans. Sorry, go ahead.
In regards to the West Bank, they're now doing obviously military incursions has been going on prior to October 7th last year, one of the deadliest years of the West Bank, and then continuing to increase from there. But they've been doing just airstrikes now into the West Bank. Has that been instituted at times prior, or is that something novel? Because, I saw that report and I was like, holy shit.
No, you're absolutely correct. The Israeli military has realized that there are no checks on its use of force, none whatsoever. They can do whatever they want to whomever they want, using as much force as they want, killing as many innocent civilians as they want, without any checks on their power. And Biden has made that clear, right? I mean, you're talking about a government that has slaughtered, according to a report that just surfaced just last week by 99 health experts who have been in Gaza in the past year. 99 American health experts published a report.
They're Americans, so you can trust them, right? I saw a white man on a television, and he's American in the plainest, correct English.
You don't trust the UN experts. You don't trust UNRWA. Fine. You know what? These are American health experts, people who visited Gaza, who have been in Gaza, and their estimate, based on the available evidence and based on their own ability to discern what is happening on the ground, is that something like 110,000 Palestinians in Gaza have already been slaughtered. So this debate, when you throw out the number 42,000, the first thing you hear from the Zionists is, well, what about what percentage of those 42,000 are militants?
Yeah.
Well, obviously the actual number is dramatically higher than 42,000. Let's suppose all 42,000, including the 2/3 that are women and children, are militants. Let's suppose the 3,000 babies under the age of 1 are militants. What about the other 70,000 not even included in the official figures? So, but to get back to your question, no, Israel has now essentially adopted the kind of Gaza policy in the West Bank, right? They, a month or two ago, entered Jenin with a fighting force of many hundreds, perhaps thousands of ground troops, bulldozing at all the streets of Jenin, demolishing hundreds of homes in the city. You saw last week they fired a missile in a cafe, a crowded cafe in Tulkarm, killing 18 civilians, including a Hamas leader. And so you're seeing the policies that have been used in Gaza now applied also to the West Bank. I can only imagine that getting worse and worse in the days and weeks and months to come.
I think it just speaks to the genocidal intent, the intent to do ethnic cleansing, because it just seems as if they have realized they can do whatever, and it just might be simpler to use all these 2,000-pound bombs where the warehouse just keeps getting filled up with them, and just to completely destroy as much infrastructure as well as lives. And then they'll just figure it out later. Essentially, I'm not sure outside of that, but it's like you said, it's like these are not rational actors by any stretch of the means. It just seems that more death and destruction is their only goal. And the Biden administration is more than happy to go along with it. Well, I am kind of scared to ask this question. You have alluded it to a little bit, but as we wrap up, where do you see this going? What are some of the things you worry about? What are some of the things like, if this happens, this could be the fastest track off of this genocidal route? What do you want to leave us with as where this is going?
I wish there was reason for optimism, but there is a great deal of reason for pessimism right now. With the United States, with an election approaching, you saw, was it either the 2016 election or the 2020 election? Israel carried out its most violent act of ethnic cleansing. I think it was the 2020 election, and it was November 3rd to November 4th, 2020, was the largest ethnic cleansing operation in something like 4 or 5 years in Israeli history, right? So Israel times its most deadly, most vicious attacks on Palestinians during time periods where they know there's going to be less media attention. And that has been an outstanding, and by the way, they do that even on a daily basis. They bomb Gaza at night. When Israeli soldiers go into the West Bank and invade homes for their various military operations, it's always at night. They don't want cameras. They don't want spotlight. They know what they're doing is criminal, so they want to hide it. That's why they do it at night. That's why they time it for the U.S. election. And so I would almost guarantee you that on November, whatever day it is, next month, there will be some grotesque action carried out by Israel's genocidal army, either in Gaza or in Lebanon or against Iran or against the Houthis or in the West Bank or probably all of the above. So that's one major reason to be concerned. And then on top of that, there'll be a period for 3-4 months from November until the inauguration in January, or 2 months, when there will be a lame duck president. I mean, lame duck in many, many ways, right? In the sense that this guy is just totally checked out. He's checked out. He's senile. He'll give Israel a blank check to do whatever it wants, and Israel knows that there's basically a sort of dad is out of town, and so I can do whatever I want. It's a very, very worrisome time. I'm talking about the very immediate next month or 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And then leading up to the election, Israel is doing its best to get to get Trump elected.
Yeah.
So what are they going to do? So what does that mean? What are the implications? What are the second and third order implications to that? To knowing that Israel wants Trump in power? I don't know, but I just can't imagine good things will come from that. They are doing what they can. They know Kamala is obviously. By the way, she's. When you really look what's the difference? There's no real difference, but still, they want Trump elected.
Yeah.
So God only knows what they're going to do between now and November to try and manufacture some kind of Trump victory. So there's just so many. And then on top of all that, like the Lebanon front is, Israel declared we'll be in Lebanon for weeks. That was what was said. This is a limited operation, right?
Yeah.
But just like the limited operation in Rafah,
yeah,
where 80% of the buildings in Rafah. I mean, have you seen the aerial footage of Rafah before and after? If limited refers to complete and total devastation, the complete destruction of every single building, every single home in the town, well, that's what Israel defines as limited. Well, guess what Lebanon has in store in the next few weeks? I would not want to be anywhere in Lebanon right now. I would not want to be anywhere in Gaza right now because those attacks continue unabated. The West Bank front is only escalating. Iran is, you never know where that could go. So there's so many reasons to be pessimistic and basically no reason to be optimistic right now. I hate to say it.
Oh, well, I had hoped that you could surprise me, but I wasn't expecting it. You'd mentioned it earlier, but you did, release a new course on Zionism. And actually, I'm going to steal one last question if you got time.
Sure thing.
The idea, or at least the ideology of Zionism as it ties into colonialism and the structures that keep tying into each other is even the way that they describe it of, oh, we have this right to defend ourselves, use overwhelming force, the dehumanization of Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims as these savages that either need to be ruled over or just completely wiped away. It's like so many manifest destiny, so many like the sun will never set on the there's just so many things that are referencing to this. So I guess, the course ties, all these things in. And I guess if you do a kind of a quick explainer of where does Zionism tie in with some of these other major violent concepts.
I think for the first time that I can recall, Zionism is a topic of conversation. It's a topic of public debate. You have people like Yuval Harari, intellectual, famous, celebrity almost, publishing op-eds in the Washington Post asking, is this the end of Zionism? This is where we're at, because more and more people are realizing that a state founded on the idea of privileging one particular ethno-religious group over all the others in that state has disastrous outcomes that we're all able to see and witness on live stream. And so people are, for the first time in my memory as an adult, I can't recall anyone ever discussing or debating Zionism. If you were to challenge Zionism or challenge the legitimacy of this ideology, you were deemed kind of outside of the consensus. You were heretical. This question had no place in public in respected circles. That is now changing. Okay. And that's one of the reasons why I'm launching this course, because I was just having a conversation a few days ago with someone who's actually following what's happening in Palestine, but I asked them what's Zionism, and they actually they couldn't provide a definition. People don't understand what Zionism is. And so the goal of this course really is for people to really understand from a historical point of view, what Zionism was, what the Zionist leaders believed, what actions they carried out in the name of Zionism, and what was necessary in order for the Zionist movement to succeed. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the question really is, and the question that every Zionist leader had to ask him or herself, was how do you create a Jewish state in a land that is overwhelmingly non-Jewish? And so that is sort of the key. And then once you create that state, how do you maintain a Jewish state in a land that is still has a huge number of non-Jews? Right? And within the borders of the state itself, it was, 15, 20%, a percentage that is growing. Within certain areas of the state, the percentage was 70, 80% in the north. Within Jerusalem, it was 40%. So how do you maintain a state that you want to be Jewish, have a Jewish character where you privilege Jews, give them special rights, give them extra rights in a country where there's all these non-Jews? What are the systems and processes and procedures that you have to implement in order to preserve that Jewish supremacy? So that is what we're going to try and understand in the course.
This is kind of this weird thing where it's just like you want to be very involved and engaged with a lot of your work, but just the word excited doesn't seem right. But I'm looking forward to being able to engage. And I do want to thank you again for your time and all the work you've done. And staying optimistic in these pessimistic times, I guess. Thanks again, and we'll hopefully have you back on sometime.
Anytime, Marcus. Take care, my brother.
Peace.